On the rowdy streets of revolutionary 18th century Paris, the civil unrest was palpable and heated, but mystery enrobed one character who confused the residents. In a time when it was good to be one step ahead of those who may want you dead, one person emerged as a master, or should that be mistress, of disguise. In their heyday, they outwitted noblemen in duels whilst dressed in a full court dress, complete with petticoats and a fanciful hat. And at other times, they blended into the background in standard men's clothing, but managed to always switch to whatever best suited the situation. But who was this mysterious soldier, debutante and diplomat, and how did they cause such a ruckus with their gender identity that eventually the London Stock Exchange placed bets on what genitalia they owned? Today on Macabre London, we uncover the story of the Chevalier d'Eon, the soldier who fought in petticoats. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Macabre London. I'm Nikki Druce, your host with a silent G, and today we'll be exploring perhaps the most fabulous soldier of all time, delving into the life and sad demise of the Chevalier d'Eon. But first, if you're new here and you love strange and spooky history and the occasional bit of historical true crime, then do yourself a favour and subscribe or follow so you never miss a new episode. If you've been enjoying the show and want to keep the spooky stories coming, then joining my Patreon is the best way to do it. Not only does it help keep the podcast alive, but it gets you exclusive extras you won't hear anywhere else, like my cosy and creepy bedtime audiobook readings. Right now I'm reading The War of the Worlds, and there's a whole haunted library of content over there just waiting for you. It's less than the price of a coffee each month, but it makes a huge difference in helping me keep the ghost light on. And honestly, I'd love to welcome you personally to our little coven of supporters, aka the Ghoul Gang. You'll be in good company, so if you've been thinking about it, now's the time. But now it's time to grab your fanciest hat, your military jacket, and your cutlass, because we're going fencing with the best swordswoman in the whole of 18th century France. To begin today's story, we have to head back to the streets of Paris in the mid-1700s and explore the social and political climate at the time. A system of absolute monarchy was in place, which meant the king, Louis XV, was in charge, and from the public's perspective, they were very much abusing their power. After a series of scandals which saw Louis mess around and give vast amounts of public money to his many mistresses, the Parisians began to wrinkle their noses at the system, which was clearly being abused by those in power. After the previous king, Louis XIV, built the largest royal residence in existence, the Palace of Versailles, with its sprawling gardens and gilded interiors, the public knew that as time passed, things were only going to get worse. Meanwhile, back in the crowded streets of the capital, the wealth divide was huge, and most Parisians lived a poor existence in slums without decent enough facilities to survive, and disease was running rife, which meant the life expectancy was at an all-time low. Much like in the UK, there was a class system emerging during this time, which was separated into three tiers. Clergy, the top tier, who were mainly all members of or high up in the Catholic Church. They didn't have to pay many taxes, if any at all. They were also able to claim something known as tithe, which was basically a way to make their living from those around them in the lower tiers of the system. Clergy were also allowed to collect 10% of people's earnings, and so of course, with a large number of people below them, this meant they were doing very well for themselves. The second tier was nobility. These were people who owned land, property, and worked for the military. Government officials were also part of this tier, and guess what? They didn't have to pay taxes either. Even though this was seemingly a good section of society to be in, some nobility was still poor and suffered as a result because they couldn't deviate from their jobs, so they often earned little but had a lot of upkeep. However, it wasn't the worst things could be. The third estate was at the bottom of the pile. These were the everyday folk who basically did everything to keep society going. They worked the fields, laboured and toiled, but it wasn't just menial labour that the third tier were restricted to. Doctors, solicitors, teachers, and many of the middle class were also squished into this all-encompassing bracket. Often, this meant that the third estate had the capability of earning more than the nobility, and so the everyday folks were taxed up the wazoo, effectively having to surrender 50% of their paycheck to effectively pay for the higher-up leeches to live their lives. Sound familiar? It's never too late to have a revolution, you know, just saying. So, as the rich got richer and the third estate became increasingly pissed off at the huge wealth gap that was emerging between them all, the civil unrest became palpable. And it's here we pick up today's story on the mean streets of Paris, just as the embers of the impending revolution were smouldering. In a poor nobility household on the 5th of October 1728, a baby had just been born, which would go on to become the talk of the town in not only Paris, but also London in a few decades. But right now, this bouncing bundle was not much to write home about, just another mouth to feed. In a grand country mansion, which France was littered with due to the nobility class, and which is why there's so many people buying them for dirt cheap and doing them up on property shows nowadays, a family were living in grandiose surroundings, but without much to their name. The Beaumont family was made up of Father Louis, a man who had a multitude of jobs in the town of Tonnerre in Burgundy, where the small family lived. Louis held the fanciful title of Director of the King's Dominions, which basically meant he did admin for the town on the advice of His Royal Highness. Louis d'Eon-Beaumont was a lawyer, and so he was deemed to be trustworthy, but he was a step above the usual as he was nobility. This differentiation would allow d'Eon to transcend the usual class barriers, and so unlike a lot of people trapped within nobility, he was given the freedom of the king, aka a promotion, which then made him the mayor of the town. Louis married Françoise de Charenton, and she was from a good, strong military background. Well, not her particularly, but her father was the prestigious Commissioner General during the war with Spain and Italy. So you could say when their baby came along, they would be born with diplomatic skills and a fighting nature. And as the years passed, it would sure seem this way. The pair's little bundle of joy was given a name, which would demonstrate their rich heritage, and this is what they decided upon. Charles, Genevieve, Louis, Augusta, André, Timothée, d'Eon de Beaumont. Imagine trying to fit that in the box on any form. Now, from here on out, we have to say that the story of this particular individual can only be described as folklorically fantastical because, whilst they did exist, they also used a ghostwriter to create their own memoir of their life, and thus, the tales have somewhat combined into something which can be seen as portraying this individual in a golden light, and as time progresses, and the more I read, well, it seems they were quite a mixed bag of a human, and a therapist would definitely have a field day with them nowadays. So what I've done with my research is peeled back the layers as much as I can to try and work out the fact from fiction, but just know that we don't 100% know exactly for definite the story of the Chevalier d'Eon, but what we do have is a composite idea of them as an individual. And as we progress through their story, I'll be using their seemingly preferred pronouns during the different stages of their life. But we have to remember this was a time before the delicate and eloquent language we have developed today for individuals' gender identity. So sometimes I may refer to they/them pronouns when it feels correct to do so. But of course, we don't have a list of what they would ultimately want to be referred to. And so I'm just going to try my best with the historical data available. So back in the mansion in Burgundy, Charles, as we'll be calling them for a short while, grew up as a scrappy but well-to-do child. He was a stellar student at school and excelled at his studies, and before long, it was obvious to his parents that he needed more than Burgundy could offer him, so at the age of 14, he was sent to Paris to continue his schooling. He then graduated from Paris University at the age of 21, having followed in his father's footsteps studying law. Paris really suited Charles, and he revelled in being a part of its bustling, emerging literary scene. He would write every single day and soon became renowned as a man of letters, securing himself a job as a contributor to a controversial publication, the Année littéraire, an anti-Age of Enlightenment doctrine which aimed to dissuade younger people from adopting more modern ideas, which veered away from religion as the primary way to live their lives. So, much like our current era, there was a divide of people who believed in science and progress, and a section of society that didn't, and it's safe to say that Charles at this point in his life was on the side of religion over science. However, his next few jobs would start to see his attitudes change, as his influences became more liberal in their ideologies, perhaps as a result of the difficulties he saw that were imposed on the Third Estate as a result of his next employer, Louis Berthier de Savigny. Louis was a financial advisor to the king, and Charles became Louis's secretary. During this time, Louis increased taxes even further on the Third Estate, which meant people were now starved, dying, and stuck in a never-ending loop of relentless debt, which was inescapable. Eventually, Louis would pay for his taxation increases during the French Revolution, being hanged from a lamppost outside the Parisian City Hall. But at this time, it was plain to see the dream was collapsing for France's elites, and they were desperate to try and extract as much as they could before it fell apart altogether. But little did they realise, every step they took just further cemented their future fate. Anyway, back to the mid-1700s. Charles wraps up his work with Savigny and gets another job with Guillaume Chrétien Lamoignon de Malesherbes. Why do I do this to myself? Guillaume was another lawyer and an ardent royalist, but unlike his previous employers, Malesherbes did understand the public dislike of the king and could plainly see that the taxation increase and the royal overspending was not a good way to keep continuing. However, the main concern for Guillaume at the time was censorship. He had been charged with removing smut from Paris, and so he employed Charles as one of his censors. Guillaume was well aware, however, that if he did decide to raid the libraries of Paris, its newsstands and its bookshops, not much would be left because, after all, the French are a notoriously sexy bunch. So the censors only took away the things that were considered far too raunchy for the general public to stop the filth supposedly rotting everyone's minds. Now, during this period of the Chevalier's life, it seemed something was happening which may have given them a flight of fancy in their mind. Coming back to those perhaps created fables, we have the first of our questionable tales to come from their mouth. Well, their written word. Around a similar time as the censorship stuff was going on, Charles recounted in their memoir that they'd been tasked with some secret spy work in Russia, as they'd been recruited by the king to work as part of their secret agent gang. Along with 3 other spies, they were sent to infiltrate the Russian monarchy, and in particular to make friends with Empress Elizabeth. At this time, the English were controlling elements of the Russian border to stop the French from trying to reach the Empress, and so they were only letting in women and children. No French men were allowed in. So in order to sneak over the line, Charles dressed in a court dress and disguised his voice to make it through the checkpoint. Here they renamed themselves as the Lady Leah de Beaumont and secured employment as a lady-in-waiting to the Empress. However, this story is thought to be almost definitely fake, and perhaps Charles was doing this as a way to justify something which was stirring within them. We do know that they did do some work in Russia, but it was more than likely not in such an undercover fashion, and upon returning to France, they were commended with a payout, but just a year later, they were drafted as a soldier and went to fight in the 7 Years' War. After time fighting, being wounded, recovering, and then fighting again, eventually Charles was given the authority to draft the treaty which would end the 7 Years' War. But in order to escape and be able to do this without interruption or being thrown back into the line of duty, they were sent to London. In London, the treaty was worked on and eventually agreed on the 10th of February 1763, being signed in Paris, bringing the war to an end. This earned Charles the equivalent of a knighthood and a forever position as a French nobleman for his services to the military. Over the next few years in London, Charles was given various diplomatic positions by the French authorities, but he turned against them and managed to forge connections with the British royals and turn spy for them, informing them of a planned invasion by France. This, of course, upset his original employers, and Charles was given orders to return to Paris at once. But he dug his heels in, and the British embassy stood up for him and decided to let them stay, as they'd effectively saved them from a potential war. France tried again to bring Charles back, and in his memoirs he recounted that another French spy had attempted to poison him to smuggle him out of the country. But again, we have to take Charles's own word with a hefty pinch of salt on that one. But seemingly out of anger, Charles's military pension was stopped by France, and as such, he was instantly cut off and set adrift in London. To retaliate and to make a bit of money, Charles published the letters in pamphlets for everyone to read. But of course, now fearing there would be serious repercussions, he went into hiding and waited for everything to die down. He was protected by the British public at large, became a Freemason, and managed to survive the next 6 years under the radar. King Louis XV knew that Charles had a lot of dirt on the monarchy, military, and knew of their underhanded tactics and dodgy dealings. And so even though they'd revealed some of their secrets, eventually the king gave the Chevalier a modest pension for keeping stum. As their time in the military became a drifting memory, Charles seemingly decided to explore more sides of their identity. Sometimes they'd wear their old military uniform, and at other times a dress, full petticoats, and a feathered hat, and sometimes a combination of both. However, in 1774, before the Revolution and after King Louis XV had died, the Chevalier was now opting to go by the name Charlotte and living their life as a woman the majority of the time. She decided she would try to make a return to Paris in the hopes her previous struggles with the monarchy would be forgotten. But Charlotte's decision to now dress as a woman was considered a shameful and disrespectful choice, and in the eyes of the authorities, it diminished her military prowess. Charlotte didn't want to dress in masculine clothing, so she still opted to wear garments which were perceived as more feminine. Their biological sex also meant they spoke with a deeper man's voice, and the Chevalier's biographer said this made their fellow military colleagues balk at the way she presented herself, and therefore they didn't accept her in their company. Charlotte was of course embarrassed by this, and so instead she began telling people that she'd been born as a biological woman and that the only reason she'd been brought up as a boy was as a result of her father's need to provide a son and heir to gain his inheritance. Demanding that she be given the official right to call herself a woman by the government, Charlotte actually was afforded the right to identify as one, with the caveat being that she now must dress in women's clothing full-time and not men's clothing ever again, with the authorities even providing a wardrobe payout for her new clothing to be made. Charlotte was told, however, that she must move away from Paris as yet another condition, and so she went back to Burgundy. Okay, so with Charlotte making her way back home, I think it's time to give her some time to move in. So let's take a second to hear about my favourite coffee brand of all time. It's the truly marvellous London Nootropics. I literally drink it every single day and have done for years now. I love it so much. I asked them to sponsor me, and I'm so pleased they did because I would more than likely tell you about this for free anyway. And just ask all my friends. I've got them all hooked on this stuff because it is incredible. London Nootropics have a fantastic new blend, Mush Love. A brand new limited edition adaptogenic coffee blend, which is my favourite product of theirs so far. This special blend is made in collaboration with Fantastic Fungi. Yes, the creators of that absolutely mesmerising and really interesting viral Netflix documentary. And it's designed to elevate your mornings in the most natural way possible, or provide your afternoon with the calm clarity you need. Mush Love really is jammed full of the good stuff. Hifas de Terra lion's mane for focus, cordyceps for energy, and chaga for immunity, all blended into a smooth, delicious coffee that's free from preservatives, artificial sweeteners, or any of that synthetic nonsense. Just pure, natural ingredients that feel like a gentle nudge from nature itself. And who doesn't want that? Surely you want to feel your best at all times, so definitely give this a go. I'll be honest, I love this new blend so much. It's genuinely rejuvenating, calming without knocking you out, uplifting without any jittery chaos. And I love this one so much I've actually changed my own subscription to be a box of Mush Love and a mix box, so I can get way more of that mushroom goodness in my life. Also, they're just a great company who really care about their products and their customers, and their customer service is next level. So if you fancy sipping on something that will boost your brain and soothe your soul, use my code MACABRE, that is MACABRE, for a whopping 20% off your order at londonnootropics.com. And that's London, NOOTROPICS.com. And if you subscribe, you get an extra discount on top of that as well, which frankly is a deal I know we can all do with right now. Give your mornings a little mush love, and who knows, you might just unlock a few hidden powers of your own. And if you try it, let me know what you think, and know you're going to love it as much as me. With Charlotte having now been sent back to her hometown, she was soon missed in London. There was one question which was circulating amongst Londoners who had grown to know of the flamboyant and eccentrically dressed Chevalier d'Eon, and with word of them moving away beginning to spread, it seemed that some people were now quite annoyed. The reason behind their anger was as a result of a wager which the London Stock Exchange had launched on the biological sex of the Chevalier, and which many had participated in. The long and the short of it was that people had placed bets on whether they were indeed biologically male or female, and with them moving back to France, this made it impossible for Londoners to find out. Charlotte was invited to reveal her sex to the stock exchange so they could finalise the bet, but she, of course, declined to answer the tasteless question, and so the bet was closed and refunds were issued. Charlotte was given legal status as a woman in the UK as a result. After almost 10 years spent in banishment in Burgundy, eventually Charlotte had some difficulties finding work, and as she wanted to rejoin the military but wasn't allowed, she asked if she could move back to London, and luckily the answer was yes. The revolution had now been and gone, and as a result, Charlotte had been cut off from any French governmental gifts she'd been receiving. She had to sell most of her belongings, and her house was taken by revolutionaries, and so the well began to run dry. To keep her fighting skills tip-top, even though she was well past middle age, Charlotte once more picked up a sabre and began fighting in fencing tournaments. Dressing the way she did, and having the skills that many would have never expected a woman to have, she wiped the floor with a majority of men that were brave enough to take her on. This became somewhat of a spectacle, and in a sad twist, Charlotte became an oddity trotted out at upper-class events for people to laugh at. Knowing that she actually still had quite a lot to give in terms of passing down her skills, she offered to begin a French women's military unit, but her proposal was denied as a ridiculous idea. But Charlotte was in a unique position, in that, as she had lived as both a man and a woman, she could see that those experiences were wildly different. As a male soldier, she'd been afforded gravitas, power, and commanded respect, but as a woman, she was dismissed as nothing short of a strange, powerless, and disrespected sideshow to be gawked at. She reflected that she could see the huge disparity of the male and female experience, and as a result, she became a huge proponent of women's equality and collected as many books as she could on women's rights. It's theorised that she, at one time, may have held the largest feminist library in the world, even before the term feminism had been coined. But I'm just putting it out there, if you're a TERF and you're listening to this, firstly what you're doing here, and just want you to think about that for a moment. At one time, the largest amount of feminist literature was held by a trans woman. So don't ever say trans women have never done anything for you, because this lady went above and beyond to make waves. In 1796, at the age of 68, Charlotte was injured during a sword fight, and this brought about the end of her swashbuckling days. With her only source of income now taken away, Charlotte struggled to make ends meet and soon sank into extreme poverty, moving in with a widow in Holborn. Charlotte couldn't make ends meet, and as a result ended up spending 5 years in a debtor's prison. Whilst inside, she struck a deal for a book to be written about her, and this allowed her to get out of jail. Now in her 70s, she was released, suffered a fall and was sadly left partially paralysed, and her last few years were entirely miserable. When she eventually passed away at the age of 81, the vultures soon appeared, circling her dead body. Her doctor was bribed to finally give the baying public the confirmation they'd wanted all these years. The doctor, on her post-mortem, wrote that the Chevalier had male organs in every respect, perfectly formed, but they also noted they also had breasts remarkably full. So the baying public finally had their answer, which they in no way were entitled to, and to which Charlotte had actually declined to acknowledge during her lifetime, but in death she could no longer withhold her consent. Now, I have gone back and forth with whether I should reveal this as part of the episode, as it does seemingly go against Charlotte's consent, but I think it's important to show that this is just that, a violation, and without revealing this aspect of her story, I feel I'd not be showing the true story and raising the hardship trans people experience all the time. But does it feel awful to do so? Yes, it does. Charlotte was buried in St Pancras churchyard, but due to the railway expansion, a lot of the gravestones were removed during the 1800s, so you won't find a headstone for her if you visit, but her name is on the memorial of notable graves which were removed during this time. But in one last respectful act, her headstone was given the feminine version of her title of Chevalier, meaning knight. It was written as Chevalier, the feminine equivalent. So even though the swashbuckling Charlotte, whose military prowess was once so strong it drew the 7 Years' War to a close, was no more, she had left an indelible mark on both French and British history, but even more so on the history of feminism. And what we have to remember is that there is no feminism without trans women standing alongside us. Thanks so much for joining me for this episode. I hope you enjoyed that little glimpse into Charlotte's fascinating life. I'll be back next time with a macabre mini mystery, but I'll be very honest, I'm not sure when the next one will be coming out as I'm going in for some routine surgery this week. So I'm hoping I'll be back up and running soon, but I might be a little bit behind. So thanks in advance for your patience. So it's even more important to be sure to hit that subscribe so you don't miss out just in case I drop off your recommendations. Now, if you love what I do and want to help me keep the macabre magic going, supporting me on Patreon is hands down the best way to do it. It's just a few quid a month, less than the price of a coffee, but it helps cover all the essentials. Archive access, research books, editing tools, and yes, the occasional much needed caffeine boost to get through the long writing nights. And to be honest, it's so helpful when I have to take a short break like I'm being forced into right now. In return, you'll get exclusive extras like my spooky bedtime audiobook readings and my Patreon-only bonus podcast, Having a Problem, which is a little weirder and a little more personal, just for members of the Ghoul Gang. A huge thank you to my top-tier producers, Christina, Heather's Leg, Lisa, Mary, Ravel, Sally, Sam, Sarah, Terry and Veronica, and to all my other lovely patrons. You lot are the metaphorical stitches which keep this Frankenstein's monster of a show together. And if you'd like your name in the credits or shouted out here, head to patreon.com/Macabre London. I'd love to welcome you personally to the Ghoul Gang. Oh, and before you go, don't forget to check out London Nootropics and use my code MACABRE at checkout for 20% off. You won't regret it. Thanks for joining me for another macabre tale from the city's backstreets. I've been Nikki Druce. Remember to stay spooky, and I'll see you ghouls next time. I don't even have any nails, so I can't do my clicky outro because I've taken them off my surgery. I'll see you when I'm back, hopefully with some nails.